flap! Hello, my dear sweet friends. Today I'm here to talk about two things that I do not want, that none of us want. I'm talking about two things that the world needs. I am, of course, referring to sequels for Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey. As of this recording, Breath of the Wild is now 2 years old and Super Mario Odyssey will be 2 this October. Even in the Nintendo world, with its often agonizingly long development cycles for its major games, that means we're at least a decent amount of the way along the path to the next major games in the Zelda and Mario franchises. I mean, Nintendo sounds like they want the Switch to be around for a good long while. 7 years seems to be a pretty good bet, though we know it'll be at least like 5. So if you ask me, it is not a matter of if these two games will get sequels on the Switch, but when. I mean, both releasing within the system's first year? Yeah, sequels are definitely happening, and that idea has me positively frothing at the mouth. Just figuratively, of course, not literally. Ahem. So what do you say we have a little chat about these theoretical games, their potential release windows, what they might be like, pros and cons for releasing them quickly, and most importantly, how give them to me now, please. I want them, give them here to me, please. Now. Please. So first, let's talk about timing. If we're looking at the usual 5 years for each game, then yeah, we've still got a way to go. We probably won't even get reveals for another 2 years, or even more in Mario's case, and that's pretty darn depressing, especially considering we're already looking at least 3 or 4 years for Metroid Prime 4. But there is one thing that could save us all, something that could potentially ride in on a glowing stallion and fill our hearts with light and give us what we so desire. Yes, the timely asset reusing sequel, a beautiful, nay, glorious thing indeed. If you'd like to hear more on the concept, I did a whole video about how I think Nintendo could release Zeldas a little more frequently without sacrificing quality whatsoever, and you can click the card popping up in the corner if you want to see it. But I'll go over the gist of it here because obviously it's very relevant. Basically, Nintendo likes to take their sweet time making some of their games. But there have been a very small number of times when they've taken a game's graphical assets and general gameplay, added a new story and some extra mechanics onto it, and put it out in record time. Usually about 2 years, which seems to be like the bare minimum for a sequel. And if this had left us with rushed, cheap, low-quality games, then I would definitely not be on board for this kind of development cycle. But that ain't what happened. Instead, we got 2 games, just for example, that you might recognize. Super Mario Galaxy 2, one of the highest-rated Mario games ever, considered by many to be a masterclass in level design. Majora's Mask, the most mature, atmospheric, and arguably the most conceptually creative Zelda ever, which stands as a series favorite in the hearts of countless fans. Yeah, 2 years for each of those games, because Nintendo didn't have to spend a bunch of R&D time building engines and creating assets and reimagining entire art styles. They took what they already had and built on top of it. And it was win-win. We got great games faster, and Nintendo probably spent a fraction of the money they would have with completely new titles. Your guess is as good as mine why Nintendo doesn't do this more often. And we don't know if that's what they're doing with Zelda and Mario right now, but we can very much hope. I would say that both Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey are particularly good candidates for timely sequels for a lot of reasons. Both of them were very big departures from most of the titles that came before them. Mario returned to the sandbox format of old and introduced the capture mechanic, which still has a ton of room for exploration if you ask me. Then Zelda, oof, it's like my favorite game ever, but it still felt like it had an immense amount of room to grow. Just so much to be built upon. In Zelda's case especially, a timely sequel would just make so much sense. They spent years just developing the overall concept and the basic mechanics, and much less actually making the game. That means they could potentially make another one in the same amount of time, and it would end up being even better, even more refined like Galaxy 2 was, or even more bizarre and creative like Majora's Mask. And of course, these 2 games are also perfect for timely sequels because they're selling like crazy. I mean, come on. You like making money and everyone buys a game? What's the best way to make more money? Make another game. And I know that people don't always agree on their Zeldas and their Marios, but at least in my experience, it is nearly unanimous. People like this timely sequel idea. Like, really, the vast majority of people seem to be into it for both games. Since, like I said, this would be a win-win situation, I feel like it would be ridiculous, even for Nintendo, to do otherwise. To spend 5 years building new titles from the ground up. Like, you have something that would be easier and cheaper, and it's exactly what your customers want? Come on, how often does that happen? How often do customers want a company to do what's easy and cheap? Now, there are a handful of reasons Nintendo might not want to do this. I don't personally think they're reason enough, but they're at least worth discussing. One potential issue is that sequels just never sell as well. Check the sales numbers for pretty much any mainline Nintendo game in any series, and you'll see that if there is a sequel on the same system, it sold less. And that makes sense. Very few people will buy the sequel without buying the first game first. But there are always going to be a good number of people who buy the first game, but never feel like picking up the second one. A series on one platform can indeed see diminishing returns. So hey, maybe Nintendo isn't in a huge rush to get out sequels to these games because they know that they might be able to spend their limited resources on something else entirely and sell more. A couple issues with this idea though. We ain't just talking about games that sold well here. We're talking about obscene numbers. Even severely diminished returns on these sequels, even as much as a 50% decrease in sales, would still be terrific sales successes for Nintendo. Oh no, Super Mario Odyssey 2 only sold half of the first one. What are we gonna do? Oh wait, that's still 7 million copies. And to put that number into perspective, Miyamoto once said to investors that Breath of the Wild would only need to sell 2 million units to break even. That might be a tall order for smaller games, but this is Zelda. If this is anything to go by, then even the relatively modest sales of Skyward Sword made Nintendo plenty of moolah. And don't forget, the Switch is still relatively young and those titles are still selling. A 50% drop for a sequel might end up looking like 10 million in a few years. Another potential issue? Making money is important, but equally important is getting systems into people's hands. It's like I've always said, it's not just about making good games. It's about making games that are exciting enough to make people shell out the money for a whole new system. Breath of the Wild and Odyssey are terrific system sellers, but unless their sequels are like super crazy amazing and new and grab everyone's attention for some brand new reason, Zelda with machine guns? Finally! Those sequels won't bring in nearly as many people as the originals did. Just as they'll see diminishing returns in terms of profit, the same will be true of system sellability. Like, how many people saw Phantom Hourglass and were like, but then when Spirit Tracks came out, they were like, oh, well, now I gotta get a DS. If Breath of the Wild and Odyssey are gonna get people to buy a Switch, their sequels ain't gonna change that too much. There's definitely an element there when sometimes a person buying a system comes down to the raw number of games they want to play, and in that case, a sequel could finally push a person over the edge. But when you're looking at the big picture, Mario and Zelda have already done their jobs selling Switches, and are still doing their jobs, and now it's just up to other games and price drops and all that to keep the sales moving. It's an opportunity cost thing. Should we spend resources on sequels that will sell relatively well, or spend those resources on something entirely new that could connect with a previously untouched crowd, whether it's a very new Mario or Zelda with all new everything, or something else entirely while we give Mario and Zelda a couple-year break. Again, I still don't think this is a particularly good reason to forego timely sequels, but, I don't know, someone at Nintendo might. Here's another one. Let's say these sequels do somehow end up connecting with audiences even more so than the originals. The Legend of Zelda Machine Gun of Light makes a huge splash and suddenly everyone in the world wants it. How does that affect sales of Breath of the Wild? Because when you offer multiple similar products, cannibalization becomes an issue. Especially if one is considered just better, people might skip the original. And then you've put your resources into two products, one of which limits the potential, halts the growth of the other. This is probably the flimsiest anti-timely sequel argument of all, but I figure it's important to hit this from every angle. Additionally, I've got a great solution to this problem that would not only eliminate potential cannibalization, but drastically hinder the rate of diminishment on sequel sales. This is another thing I covered in my Zelda release schedule video. There are companies that will put out a whole trilogy of games in the span of 5 years or so. Because they put in a lot of effort and use the same basic elements each time, they're able to get them out quick. And very few people complain that the games are coming too fast because 1, the quality is still there, usually for the most part, and 2, they have a continuing story. People become invested in the characters and want to see what happens to them next. I know Nintendo and stories don't always get along, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon, especially with Mario. I feel that a little story can go a long way, and I was pretty happy with the story in Odyssey, but most people can't be bothered with stories in Mario games, yada yada yada. I can't see an ongoing epic happening anytime soon. But Zelda's different. Nintendo themselves have said that Zelda is their storytelling series. I feel that it's still got a lot of room to grow in that department, and Breath of the Wild left me disappointed in some ways, but the potential is there. A sequel that used all the same characters and showed what happened to them next? people would be way more likely to come back for the second course. And I know this is turning into a larger discussion just as it did in my other video, but even if it's too late for Breath of the Wild, it's something that Nintendo could invest into in the future. Majora's Mask was great because it was great, but it was also great because we got to see what happened to Link at the end of Ocarina of Time. And that was huge for me, especially when you consider that the list of different Links is growing bigger with nearly every release. Ongoing stories would help prevent things from getting stale. It would open up so many more creative possibilities. But I'm really getting off track here. Let's dial it back. Point is, hire some writers, make us fall in love with some of Zelda's characters, then keep telling stories with those characters, even if for only 1 or 2 additional games before moving on to another piece of the timeline, and that's gonna keep sales going strong. Heck, you know how Nintendo sequels on the same system tend to sell less? Well, look at PlayStation's Uncharted series. 3 games on 1 single system. But not only did the sales not diminish, they went up! People became invested, and once that happened, they absolutely weren't going to skip any additional entry. They had to see what happened next. Now, let's finally talk specifics for a bit. I'm not going to go too deep into what we could potentially see in sequels to Breath of the Wild and Odyssey because that could be a whole series of videos, but let's touch on a few ideas. As I said, Breath of the Wild has the most potential. If you watched my review, you'll know that I felt it was lacking a true crafting system, despite seeming like the entire game was designed to support one. If I have to pick one single thing for Breath of the Wilderer to do differently, it's that. Fighting Ganon in Hyrule and saving Zelda again. I wouldn't like that, but whatever, fine. At least give us something to do with all those materials we collect, and the feedback loop will be stronger than ever. In addition to that, though, I could see them adding a new rune or two. Developing the ones they already have sounded like it took a long time, and they're all useful enough that I wouldn't want to see them go, but I could see like one solid new one doing a lot to change up the gameplay. Dungeons were definitely also something that a lot of people felt were lacking in Breath of the Wild, so some more substantial dungeons would be very much welcome, especially if they weren't at the expense of, fewer shrines or something like that. Then, even if the basic overworld gameplay is the same, we could just use more stuff to do. More enemy types, more tasks to accomplish, that kind of stuff. Just the original, but some more. Just a few new mechanics to play with, some more ways to interact with the world, new baddies to fight, new towns to visit, people to talk to, all that. The gameplay is already so good that it really wouldn't take a lot to wow me all over again. And man, if they do end up making a straight-up sequel with the same Link and everything, I would love to see Link leave Hyrule. I'm sick of Hyrule. I want a Majora's Mask Oracle Games kind of situation. I mean, all that falls in line with my whole continuing story thing. I do know that it's hard to have consistent characters if you have Link travel to another kingdom, but let's face it, the main characters were the champions and they're dead people, aren't they? They're probably not going anywhere. But maybe Zelda could come along. Maybe they go on a trip together and they get stranded somewhere. I don't know, maybe it's a neighboring land and you can see all the old characters here and there. Maybe it takes place in Termina again. Okay, pump the brakes, that's another video. So that's Zelda, but what about Mario? Well, I think an Odyssey sequel would be a little simpler to pull off. They're gonna start with another Bowser kidnapping Peach story. You know they are, but maybe there's another silly spin on it. Whatever the case, you really don't need a lot of new basic mechanics because of the very nature of the original. Odyssey 1 had you going from black and white hat ghosts to dinosaurs to gardening robots to realistic humans in a city and even the stinking moon. Odyssey 2? Just do it again. Make another wacky series of whatever kingdoms. Galaxy was all about space, Sunshine was an island vacation, and while I can appreciate a consistent theme, I can also really appreciate the creative freedom of Odyssey. It can be anything it wants, so the developers can do anything they want. Similarly, if this is a straight-up sequel with Mario and Cappy, which I most certainly hope it is, it's all about new captures. Just tons and tons of new creatures to capture. And hey, you can have some of the old ones in there too. I adore the variety that the capture mechanic brings to Odyssey, so as long as they're all fun to use, like most of the ones in Odyssey 1, where having more will of course just be better. So yeah, like I said, pretty simple. New kingdoms to visit, new things to capture, boom, you got yourself a Super Mario Odyssey sequel. That by itself would be enough to get most people champing at the bit, but if they wanted to do us one better, they could put a little more focus on platforming. Super tight level design was something I felt Odyssey kinda lacked, so if they just doubled down on those special levels where you don't have Cappy to help you out, made them a little more like the levels in Galaxy 2 and 3D World, Odyssey 2 would be the best of both worlds and would please a lot of the people who were dissatisfied with Odyssey 1. Well, unfortunately, when it comes to potential Mario and Zelda sequels, we just don't know what will happen. Maybe Nintendo's being Nintendo about it, and we won't see sequels until 2022. Or maybe they're totally on the same page we are, and we can expect announcements really soon. My pessimistic nature tells me the latter thought is a dangerous one, but there's still that one little part of me that knows it's possible. Because here's the thing, at least if you're going off their track record, a timely Nintendo sequel means a 2-year wait. And with really big releases, Nintendo generally makes us wait at least 8 months before reveal and release, something like that. It's never really shorter than 8 months for the really big ones. Breath of the Wild is already 2 years old. Odyssey will be 2 this October. We could conceivably get an announcement for Odyssey 2 during a Nintendo Direct in April, 1 month from this recording, for release this December. It is possible, and we could get an announcement for Breath of the Wild 2 at any time, especially considering Nintendo likes to reveal Zelda games 18 years before they come out and delay them 12 times. Really, anything is impossible as far as announcements go. Again, I'm not getting my hopes up or anything. Nintendo recently posted a job listing for someone to help with Zelda dungeon design, and I can only hope that the job isn't for the next mainline Zelda, because that would mean that they're just now starting, and we'd be looking at the usual 5 years plus all over again. But that tiny part of me can still dream. That tiny part of me can go into each and every direct knowing that it's at least possible that at any single moment we could potentially get an announcement for one of these 2 games. And I gotta say, that's exciting. Even more exciting, even if it's extra unlikely, is the idea of both sequels coming out in the same year. Another year dominated by Zelda and Mario? Oh. Furthermore, one last reason for them to hurry it up with sequels. I understand that if the Switch is going to be around for 7 years, maybe they don't want to release sequels too early, and instead they want to wait until the halfway point or further. But if they do get them to us quick, then they can take a bunch of extra time working on the next Mario and Zelda games so that they can be ready by the next system's launch year. If they could make Mario and Zelda first-year console staples, like a regular thing that we could always count on, I'd be quite the happy monster. Before I go, I would like to say, Nintendo, if you're listening to this, if you give us Mario and Zelda sequels within the next year, you can make it my birthday and Christmas present. No joke, it'll count for both. You just think about that, all right? It's a pretty darn good deal if you ask me.